is going to be innovative teaching methods to discuss abortion. And 1 second here while I switch over to the slides. Right. So this is my 7-minute SLAM presentation. This is discussing a particular lecture that I gave in a course on moral philosophy last autumn, and how I might have done that lecture differently, how I might do it differently the next time. But very quickly, I want to go over some personal goals that I have with my choice of teaching methodologies. First, I always try to encourage the students to debate, to challenge me, to disagree with me on things, not to take me as the final answer. The point here is really to encourage people to learn actively, not passively. Compare this with the notion of constructive alignment. So it's a very constructivist approach, I think, or in sympathy with constructivist approaches, to rather have the teacher as a facilitator rather than as a dispenser of information. Now, I note, even in Sweden, I find it difficult to encourage my female students to speak up. I don't know why this is a problem even in Sweden, but I try to encourage them to do so. They seem to need a little extra encouragement to speak up. They often are inclined to let the male students in the class take the vocal lead. One of my other major goals, besides encouraging debate and disagreement, is helping my students to construct and express an argument both orally and in writing. So to be able to express their opinions clearly, orally and in writing, to feel confident about stating a particular point of view and able to defend it up until the point at which they realize that they are wrong, because not because opinions themselves can be wrong, but because opinions can be grounded in factual errors. So in everything I do, in all my choices of teaching methodologies, I try to push both the students and myself a little bit out of our comfort zones. Not too much, of course, because then when people get too uncomfortable, it's not a good learning environment. But if you have a nice balance between, being not too uncomfortable, but also not too comfortable, and this, I think, can be compared very favorably with variation theory. So what you're trying to do as an instructor, what I'm trying to do as an instructor, is to encourage students to take on different points of view, different perspectives on things that they have oftentimes very set views on. And I tried to do this by discussing potentially controversial subjects, also by mixing instructional language. So although I still do most of my lecturing in Swedish, I do switch into, in English, I do switch into Swedish now and then, even for an entire lecture, because it helps to break both the students and myself out of just getting into one study routine. Again, what my goal here is to facilitate a non-hierarchical model of the teacher as the facilitator, rather than the dispenser of information. Generally, I try to avoid group work, although you'll see an exception to that a little bit later. But generally, I try to avoid it because it's hard to ensure that everyone is contributing their fair share, hard to evaluate what the individual contributions are. And I see this very often with group work that is not planned particularly well by other instructors, or I think is not planned particularly well. It's one person ends up oftentimes doing the work for the entire group. Another thing that I want to mention just in passing is that I always post online a copy of my slides, papers for recommended reading if I have any, and recordings of all of my lectures. So the lecture in particular that I want to look at for a few minutes today was the lecture on abortion. This is part of an introductory course in moral philosophy. It's the only course in moral philosophy that many of these students are going to have. They don't get so much grounding in philosophy in the current program at all, just a few basic courses in moral philosophy and philosophy of science. Now, abortion is not so controversial or so commonly discussed in Sweden, It is a huge source of controversy in the States. At the same time, abortion was, if I'm correct here, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, illegal in Sweden until 1967. That's roughly when it became legal across Europe. There are still significant restrictions after the first trimester, as there are most places in the world. Now, although abortion itself is not particularly controversial in Sweden, it is worth noting that there are some philosophers, including some prominent philosophers, including the one we were reading for this particular course, a person named Peter Singer, who have argued that abortion rights should not stop at birth. And there is no reason why parents should not be able to put to death, in effect, their newborn infants if the newborn infants are severely incapacitated in various ways. Not just let the baby die, but actually actively kill it. That this should be an acceptable form of abortion. What's interesting here is that when you talk about newborn infants, then suddenly people, including people in Sweden, suddenly are like, wait a second, I don't think that's okay. Now, in the US context, abortion has been hugely polarizing, as shown in part by the choice of labels, pro-life versus pro-choice. As the pro-choice people like to point out, they consider themselves just as pro-life as the people who call themselves pro-life. I prefer to use the term anti-abortionist, probably because I would consider myself pro-choice, but there's a tendency by anti-abortionists, or if you will, pro-choice people, to say that the other side is pro-abortion as opposed to pro-choice, and very few people are actually willing to say, at least, that they're pro-abortion. And I think very few people are pro-abortion, rather they're in favor of allowing a choice to the woman. And there's also a tendency by anti-abortionists to say that pro-choice people are in favor of a complete absence of restrictions. Now, what doesn't help things is that some pro-choice persons in the US actually do indeed argue that way, as if there should be no restrictions whatsoever, as if a woman should be able to walk in on the day she's having the baby and say, I decided not to, as if that would happen, but they say that she should have the right to, and I think that really is distorting the discussion in the US context. So the lecture as I delivered it consisted of 11 slides created in Impress, which is a freeware replacement for PowerPoint. What I did by way of innovation, I went beyond the textbook discussion. There's a whole chapter in the textbook devoted to abortion, but I went beyond the textbook discussion in describing the US situation. And what's a notable error in the textbook, at least with respect to the US context, namely Singer claims in the textbook that the abortionists, the pro-choice people, insist on there being an absolute point at which life begins, and the pro-life or the anti-abortionists insist on a graded view of personhood. And at least in the US context, it's exactly the other way around. So it's the pro-life or anti-abortionists who say that life begins precisely at, often they will say precisely at the, in fact, most often, precisely at the moment of conception, whereas it's the pro-choice people who prefer the gradual view of personhood, and so they have no problems with no restrictions on abortion in the first trimester, but increasing levels of restrictions as you proceed through to the third trimester. That's the common view among pro-choice people in the States, and I think in Sweden and in most countries. So I went beyond the textbook in describing the US situation. I used a newspaper cartoon strip, Doonesbury by Gary Trudeau, which did a series of cartoon strips several decades ago called Silent Scream 2, the prequel. It was lampooning, but in a very thoughtful and sensitive way, an anti-abortion movie called Silent Scream, which even at that time was planning to make a sequel. And his point with that strip was that although there is a meaningful discussion to be had about abortion and when exactly human life begins, Silent Scream, the original film, or the planned sequel, was not a good way of actually pushing that discussion forward. So we went through, it was a week-long or a week-and-a-half-long strip of cartoons, and then I showed a 20-minute video by something called the Center for Medical Progress, which is an organization in the States that you wouldn't realize it from the name, but they're working very much to restrict access to abortion. They believe that life begins at the moment of conception. And why this video is so important is that the Center for Medical Progress produced a series of 4 videos purporting to show that an employee of Planned Parenthood in the United States talking very enthusiastically over coffee with a clandestine person from the Center of Medical Progress about how they encouraged abortion in order to harvest baby parts to sell to the highest bidder and make money harvesting baby parts. So the huge thing in the US, these videos went viral. Various state legislatures attempted to defund Planned Parenthood. There were discussions in Congress about trying to shut Planned Parenthood down. This despite the evidence that came out very quickly that the videos were heavily doctored and they were not presenting the discussion as it had actually happened with this employee of Planned Parenthood. But I want to talk about what I might have done differently, which is the real point of the Science Slam talk. First of all, what I might have done is to lecture without slides. I think I get very much hung up on lecturing with slides. And although I just use the slides for talking points in order to get the discussion going, nevertheless, it ties me to a physical place in the room. It leaves me a little less spontaneous about what I'm saying. And when it comes to a topic like abortion, it's very easy, I think, for me to talk on about the US situation. And that's good at getting students to open up and present their own opinions. I always try to encourage questions from the students. During the lectures, I encourage them to interrupt me with questions, but I think that would be easier to do if I weren't using slides, as ironically I'm doing here. What else I might have done is to break into discussion groups for several current event stories regarding abortion. For example, the case of Bebe Shui, who is a woman in Indiana. She was charged with murdering her fetus because she attempted suicide. The suicide was unsuccessful, but the baby died. She was charged with infanticide. What eventually happened with the case is she pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and served a couple of years of time in jail and is out of jail. Okay, so the real proposal here, though, what would be more innovative and I think a good application of the teaching methods, the innovative teaching methods we discussed in the course, would be to run a debate. Divide the class into 2 groups randomly assigned. One group must argue in favor of defunding Planned Parenthood. The other must argue against defunding it. With the instructors, a moderator, ideally having a group of other lecturers as jury. And this to get the students to be able to, I don't think anyone would have difficulty arguing against defunding Planned Parenthood, but in order to construct an argument for defunding, that would be rather hard. Then individual students evaluated for the number and quality of responses with +1 for a good response, with the Goldschent and Velkoschent thresholds discussed obviously in advance, discretionary extra points for working well together as a group. The winning side then would be announced after a self-assessment by each group of how well they did, a follow-up with a short written report, or a question on the exam asking students to summarize the other side's arguments and what they did well. So, in terms of evaluating this proposal, it's the proposal for a debate. It's an instructional format that is not going to be one that the students are so used to using. It's an opportunity to teach about ad hominem arguments, which are arguments against the person rather than against the argument, and hopefully show the students how to avoid them. because it's very easy for all of us to slip into attacking the person, slip into attacking people's character rather than really trying to understand the value behind their argument. And no matter how bad the argument is, and no matter how little value we see in it, almost without exception, there is value in everyone's arguments somewhere. Even if it's not being followed through to reasonable conclusions. So this is an exercise as well in critical thinking and argument formation, something that students need for whatever subjects they go on to study, something I think that philosophy does particularly well, something that philosophy can teach particularly well. And then here are some references, and I will go ahead and stop the screen sharing, stop the broadcast, and thank you very much.